During World War II, Quilters of Canada made over 400,000 quilts for the bombed-out families in the UK and Europe. That's just a mind-boggling number for me. How could a small country produce so many quilts in such a short time? And why do so few people know about it? And it's such a tragedy that now the quilters have passed and can no longer tell their stories. Today's guest is trying to change that. JOANNA DERMENJIAN is researching these quilters. Where did they make them? What did they make them with? And with whom did they make them? It's an important history of women in wartime, arming strangers across an ocean with warmth and comfort. So grab your sewing and a cup of tea, and here's my interview with JOANNA DERMENJIAN. Welcome to the channel. Thank you very much for being with us today, JOANNA. Where are you coming to us from?
I'm in Kingston, Ontario.
Now, are you originally from Kingston?
No, I'm from London, Ontario. That's where I was born and grew up. And then I've lived in Toronto and I've lived in Ottawa, but settled in Kingston where my husband is.
So you got on my radar because I was listening to an episode of Haptic and Hue. And you and Joe Andrews were talking about all these hundreds of thousands of quilts that went to England and Europe from Canada. So how did you come to researching quilts?
Well, I had enrolled at Queen's University here in Kingston to do a master's degree in cultural studies. And I was wanting to investigate women's practice of stitching by hand for leisure. One day when I was just doing some research online, I stumbled on this Red Cross quilt. And it was on the Canadian Red Cross website, and just had a little blurb about it. And I was very intrigued by this idea that women had been involved in quilt making in the war, and it was the first that I'd heard of it. So I was curious and investigated some more.
So you're looking at it from the cultural side of it, not from the textile side of it.
Well, I don't think you can look at one without the other. I think that the actual textile itself leaves us clues, but my primary interest is in women's practice of stitching. So yes, in that way, I would say so.
It's funny because that's how I approach quilting too. There's the craft and the colors and everything, but I really believe that quilting fills the maker's bucket. You know, there's a replenishment that's happening. Yeah. And I often think back to my great-grandmother or my great-great-grandmother who in Southern Ontario, there was this expectation that you would have 11 to 13 children. You would be having children till you were 49 years old. And after working all day, making food, and when we're talking about making food, we're talking about going out and killing the chicken and defeathering them, coming in, and in those few moments of time, they choose to quilt. People often really go deep into, oh, they were just using up scraps. Well, they could have had a choice of doing all sorts of different things. They could have been writing letters. They could have been reading a book, but they chose to quilt.
Exactly. That needs to be thought about. We need to consider it and really try to get a handle on what might have caused them to do that. We don't ask enough questions about what was it about quilting that would be that thing that they would go to. And of course, they had to do darning as well, and they had mending and so on. But somewhere along the way, they decided to make quilts. And I think that that was just a joyful moment in their lives, just a chance to be creative. Mending is not particularly creative, and neither is darning. These days it is. It's quite fun. But back then, I don't think it was considered a creative outlet. And I think that patchwork was a creative outlet for many women, for them to put so much time and interest in it. They also had the opportunity back then to show their quilts at country fairs. And this was a way that the people who were putting on the agricultural fairs would encourage or entice women to come to the fair, was to display women's handwork. And there was a great deal of pride and interest in the work that women were doing that was creative.
Have you seen any of the work by Barbara Brackman?
Yes.
And how she collected those patterns. And that was fascinating to learn how the publishing of a quilt block in a magazine would increase its circulation.
And how also she's done a really interesting study along with Mary Kay Waldvogel, is that in between at the end of the Second World War to the sort of quilt revival in the 1970s, there were no magazines and there was no published books happening. And the way that women exchanged patterns that they had from their grandmothers is super interesting. How they sort of set up a round robin and sent each other these packages of quilt patterns that they just drew by hand and traced each other's and then sent them out to each other. It's really fun.
In Wales, there was a tradition of itinerant quilters going around and making quilt sandwiches and just going from town to town. Have you found that tradition in Canada at all?
I haven't encountered that at all. I think one of the challenges in Canada is that we don't have a lot of recorded history about quilting. And so we don't have a lot to work with. So it's not to say something like that wasn't happening, but we don't have a lot of recorded history.
We're not even that far into this interview, and already my brain has gone off in 5 different directions. How, as a researcher, do you keep the, not blinders on, but the focus on, and you don't go off in 25 different directions?
That's a great question. The research is really challenging because it's sort of buried in newspapers and in archives. And through COVID, the archives that I had access to were digital archives only. So that's what I was working with and continuing to work with. And what I do is I ask myself a question and then try to find the answer. So I'm looking for clues about how the quilts were made. So looking for some mentions about fabrics and textiles. I'm looking about how the groups were formed. I'm trying to get a sense of just some suggestion of maybe why or what they were feeling. So I just really, really stay focused on that. And then I choose one newspaper and go through it very, very thoroughly and carefully, trying to find little clues that answer those questions that I have.
All these communities in that time had lots of periodicals or newspapers or weekly things. I'm always amazed when I do research on my ancestry, how, a small little community would have a newspaper and they would have a column of who was visiting and who wasn't visiting and who did this and who did that. And how much of that is digitalized yet?
I'm not finding a great deal in Canada. In the US, there is much more that is digital, but in Canada, we're missing a lot. I'm very fortunate to have found the Winnipeg Tribune. It's an amazing resource for this information. And like you said, on one column, it's going to say somebody visited someone. And then on the other column, it's going to say the women of this group met together and this month, they made these items. And a whole list of the items that they made. So those are the pages that give me the most clues. Those women's pages, society pages that tell what women were doing.
So what kind of groups were they? Did they have guilds? Were they associated with farmers associations? What kind of groups have you found?
I haven't found any guilds. What I have seen, first of all, there were Red Cross workrooms. So the Red Cross would form these, and there were some of these before the war, but the number of them that formed during the war was exponential. I'm looking at how they formed their communities and what was it that they had in common to get together and to just make. And I found a lovely article in the Winnipeg Tribune entitled "The Little Street That Went to War." And it lists the names of these women who gathered together to make quilts. Their thing in common was that their sons were enlisted and overseas. So they all lived on the same street and they got together and they quilted together. And that's how simple and humble some of the groups were. The groups included every different type of religious organization, farm organizations, patriotic organizations, the Rebecca Lodge, which is a part of the Odd Fellows Association. There's so many different ones, and there's there's no way to actually say what it was that brought these women together, except that everyone was at war. And I think one of the things that I've come to realize is I've always thought about war as something that was primarily what men did. And the images in my mind would be sort of men charging up a hill with a gun. But I'm looking now with all of my reading, I'm looking more that war is like a cultural event. It was happening in everyone's lives. We can't just say it was happening over there. For these women, it was happening right there in their homes, in their minds constantly. It was happening to the children who were going to school every day and gathering salvage items and helping pack boxes. War was ever present for them. And so choosing to get together to make something was a way to do something themselves as part of their war effort.
So when did you discover the sheer volume of quilts that went overseas? Where did that number come from?
The number that I quote right now is over 400,000 quilts were made. And that is a number that I've gathered from the Canadian Red Cross for 5 of the provinces of Canada. There are 4 more provinces and Newfoundland unaccounted for so far in terms of me being able to find the exact number. So it's definitely over 400,000. I know that in Ontario alone, over 250,000 were made, and that was only up until 1944. So there were still many more made after that. The very interesting thing I've found now is that that's only the Red Cross number. And I'm finding more organizations who were sending separately from the Red Cross and sending volumes. So there was a group out west that was sending, and they were called V bundles, like V for victory. So the V bundles sent 72 tons of clothing and quilts themselves outside of the Red Cross. So we really don't have a sense of the numbers, except that it was massive.
I'm trying to just even get my head around that number. Like, it's just so huge.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the quilts either. Over the Red Cross has recorded over 55 million comforts went from Canada to Britain. And comforts were everything from sheets and pillowcases and robes and slippers for the hospitals to knitted items, socks, scarves, helmets, balaclavas. Women were making leather jackets lined with old fur coats for the Navy seamen on the North Atlantic. And then on top of that, blankets and quilts and Afghans, which are the things that I'm trying to actually research now.
And they were making them in between caring for children, running the farm, running the home, looking after elderly parents.
Exactly.
How many actual quilts have you found that were made in this time period?
As far as I know right now, there's women in Britain and in Europe who are documenting, they're doing an actual inventory when quilts are found. Between what I've found in Canada and what they found there, it's about 250 to 300 surviving quilts, which really isn't very many when we consider how many were made. In Canada, I've located 12 quilts that are in personal or public collections that appear to be Red Cross quilts or wartime quilts.
Do I understand that it was frowned upon to actually sign it or put a label of the maker on these quilts?
I have heard that, and I have not been able to confirm that. So I know that the Red Cross was putting labels on the quilts that they sent. And so there'd be a little label sewn on, just like an inch by a half an inch, really tiny, but it said gift of the Canadian Red Cross Society. I have a quilt, for example, that says Canadian Red Cross Kitchener branch. But then I've also found a letter from someone in England who said, I found a tag pinned onto the quilt with your name and address on it. And I wanted to thank you for the quilt that you sent. So I'm not sure really definitively. I'm guessing the Red Cross might have taken off those little notes, but the ones that went privately, they might have been identified.
Are you working with people in England trying to find the other side of this story? You've got the story here of us making them. What is the story of them receiving them?
It's really wonderful. They started researching these quilts actually there was a woman doing it in the late 90s was looking into what she could find out. And then there was a group that formed around 2005, 3 women who were very interested in documenting the quilts and finding out more. And they were in touch with the Canadian Red Cross as well. So they've got an archive of material there, and they are the ones who are documenting the ones that are found, and people get in touch with them. Sometimes people are donating quilts to them, and sometimes it's just to say, okay, here's another one, here's where it was found, here's what the tag is. And so we are communicating there. The part that is really missing, and I am just hoping I'll find a researcher in England who would be interested in picking up the ball on that end, is where did the quilts go when they arrived in England, and how were they distributed? And I know a little bit about that it was the Women's Voluntary Service in England. It was a group of over 1 million women who were volunteering their time to take care of the civilians and make sure that they were looked after when their homes were being bombed out, making sure they were fed and clothed. But I don't understand how that all happened and how the quilts were distributed when they got to England. And that's a hard thing for me to research from Canada. I mean, I'd be happy to go and spend a year over there. That would be a hardship either. That would probably mean I have to do a PhD, so I'm not sure.
So you say your interest is in the women's work and women's pastime and the craft of it. Are you working with anybody dealing with the textile part of it and what these quilts are made of, what you're finding in the middle, the binding and the techniques?
Every quilt is different. And Maxine in England has been sharing some of the techniques and the fabrics that she has seen. But what we're identifying, I'd say, between what she's told me and the quilts that I've looked at, and also what I'm finding in the newspaper archive, women were collecting the offcut fabrics from factories that were making clothing. And so in Kitchener, for example, the Forsyth Shirt Factory. I know in Wooler near Trenton, there was Pajama Factory. There were wool factories in the Hespeler area. They were making men's suits and military uniforms, and they were contributing their offcuts. So women would go around and collect the offcuts and bring them back to their group and distribute them and make quilts from those. I had a chance to interview a woman, she's 89 years old, and she remembered making quilt blocks in her one-room schoolhouse in Elgin, Ontario. And she told me how they made the blocks, the construction method. But what was also interesting, she said there was a bag of scraps from Eaton's. And for her to remember it was from Eaton's is an interesting fact. But after she told me that, I found an ad in a period newspaper that said you could buy from Eaton's a bag of quilt scraps, 39 cents a pound, and it would be enough to make one quilt top. So that connects well with what she described to me, and I wouldn't be surprised if many of the quilts were made from dress fabric scraps from Eaton's.
What are you finding used for the batting in the middle? Was it wool? Was it cotton?
I think there were a variety of things used, but I really haven't explored that yet because I haven't taken apart any quilts. One quilt that has a lot of holes in it, I was able to see there was sort of bunched up cotton batting inside. I have been told by the women in England that the Red Cross distributed the batting and the backing at some point during the war, but I have not found a record of that yet, so I can't confirm it. But there is a possibility because the backing on many of them looks similar. It's a striped sort of a flannel. One that I've seen is gray and blue, and the other one is a sort of a pink and a blue, but they're very distinctive striped flannel that may have been what the Red Cross distributed.
Well, I've even find in our own charity efforts that the cost of the batting and the backing is almost an expense too far. There's many people that accumulate a lot of quilt tops before they can afford to go out and buy that batting and the backing. So that is a practice that is still done today, that supplying of that for a group.
Oh, it is. Okay, that's interesting to know.
My Toronto Modern Guild, we're making quilts for survivors, and the guild is actually financing that part of the batting and the backing.
That also raises another point that's interesting about this is these women paid to participate in this program. And so when they came together at their meetings, everybody brought 10 cents and contributed that to the fund. And they would use that to buy materials. They also occasionally sold quilts or auctioned quilts in order to raise more money for materials. So they were very involved. It's like, I'm not only going to give my time, but I'm also donating money to be able to contribute to make sure that this happens.
And I'm wondering if, the number is so huge, whether some people had stockpiles of tops. Like I've actually am the recipient of 3 quilt tops that a friend found in her grandmother's home, which she suspects are her great grandmother's, that the tops were made, but again, the backing and the batting were too expensive, or she just didn't know how to quilt. She knew how to piece, but she didn't know how to quilt. And maybe it was the group situation and everything that brought in those quilt tops that hadn't been made into quilts. And that's why maybe more were made than you would think.
I think that's a possibility. I did find one reference in the newspaper that said that women were bringing out all of their old quilts that they didn't, weren't using. And at the beginning of the war, those are the ones that were sent. So they would bring blankets and quilts out of storage. I wonder sometimes if that's why there are so few historical quilts in Canada, that many of them went across during the war. One of the Red Cross quilts that has shown up in England is a log cabin, and the fabrics in it are not 1930s, 40s. So it's an example of that, either, like you say, it was quilted at that time, or it was actually quilted earlier and just donated as it was.
When you started this, did you know how to quilt?
I knew how to sew. I knew how a quilt was made, but I hadn't made a quilt. And I had a quilt kit in my stash, and I thought, all right, I'm going to sign up now and I'm going to make this quilt. And the local quilt store actually was offering a course on making that exact kit. So it was perfect. It was meant to be. And I decided I needed to learn how to make one in order to actually understand what these women had done and the work that's involved in doing it. So I haven't finished that quilt yet, but I have finished 3 quilts.
The first one's actually kind of hard to finish because you learn so much as you're doing it, right?
Yes, yeah.
I know you're probably in that spot and you're stressing out about points not lining up and things not being square. And if you knew how to sew before, then you probably were thinking, how hard could it be?
I'm more into the improv quilts. I made a quilt with one of Sherry Lynn Wood's workshops, and I love doing improv because it takes away any concern about the points and lines and things matching up. It's really just a lot of fun in creating cloth. And I really enjoyed that.
And the quilts that you're finding, are there any pattern goes, or were they sort of channeled into making quilt blocks? Are you finding crazy quilts, those improv quilts? Are you finding everything?
There's a bit of everything. But I would say that the ones that are using the offcuts from the factories are more likely to be a crazy quilt pattern, and they seem to be a 10 or 12-inch block on a muslin backing, or maybe unbleached feed sack backing, and then fabrics added on top of that in a crazy pattern, and then all of those put together. So I don't know if they distributed a pile of fabric to women and they just took them home and made their blocks and brought them together. I don't have all of that yet. Not really sure, but there are a lot of crazy blocks for sure.
The amount of information out there, do you feel like you're just touching the top of the iceberg?
Oh yes, for sure. And it's sort of like making a puzzle. Like you've got massive number of puzzle pieces, and you put a few together and you go, oh, I see it now. And then you put another one there and you go, oh no, I don't really know where this is going. So I don't really know what the finished end look of this story is, but it's a lot of fun actually researching it and finding out these little tidbits and putting pieces together.
Is the story so much bigger than you thought it was going to be?
I thought it was going to be easier, I would have to say. I thought there somewhere I was going to come across some information that was really going to pull all of this together, but I'm not sure that that exists. I do think it's in small archives and in small newspapers where we're going to find the stories. I was speaking to the archivist at the Red Cross because I was frustrated by how difficult it was. And she said that because this happened regionally, and it happened in communities, it was all very separate. It wasn't one big, massive movement. It was all individualized because women were making them together in their community. That the records after the war, it wasn't seen as something that they would keep. It was just like, we just did this. You know, it was just something they did at that time. So keeping a record of it wasn't anything that they thought was important. So the clues in for some is what the newspaper said on that given day, but there's also a little bit of information in some women's institutes scrapbooks where they say, here's what we made this month, or here's what we made last year. But it's all just little kind of tiny bits like that. And the parts that I really need to know right now is really, how was the construction done? Where did they get their fabrics? Can I find that in writing somewhere? Those are the kinds of things that I'd really like to find proof of. I can say this quilt looks like it's all made of shirting scraps, which are likely from a shirting factory. But until I can find that factory that says they donated their shirting scraps to women, I feel like I need to have both sides of that story in order to really say definitively, this is what happened. And I think it's important for us to know, it's important for us to record this and to know the challenges that women went through to keep this going. They did this for 6 years, and they even did it after the war. They kept on going because there was still a great need in Europe for clothing and for quilts, for Eastern Europe, particularly. Women and children really needed clothing, and women continued to be involved in making even after the war. But it's not recorded.
I remember my grandmother talking about the families that they brought over to help on the farm from Holland. I think every 5 years they had a new couple, and having to outfit them in everything.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah.
From top to bottom, sheets, blankets, clothing, everything.
I read that there were 150 million people in Europe displaced after the war. And that's a large number of people. If you imagine what they would need in their daily lives. And Canada continued to be involved in helping Canadian women and children did anyway.
You know, my grandfather fought in the war and passed right at the very end. But in Canada, his family was still fed and still sheltered. Even though it wasn't the greatest situation, my grandmother still had access to her parents. She still had access to his parents. There was no chance that they would ever be without a home. And many people were in that same situation. You know, people here were fed, they had milk, they had meat. And whereas my husband's family were in Britain and very different situation.
Right.
You know, children and parents being separated, lack of home, lack of food, and being on rations for many, many years after the war.
Yes, exactly. We don't talk about that a great deal unless it's been within our family. We don't really know about that. Again, it's not, and Canada continued to contribute in that time period. So it's important that we have that understanding of our own history, and as a country, how charitable we were and how involved we were with other people that we take it for granted now that we're a global society. But back then, it was just what they could get from the newspapers. And their newspapers would be delayed and not get to them, but they'd hear of a need and they'd just continue to give where they could.
In these women's organizations, are you finding any evidence of how they were organized?
I'm finding that in some of the groups. For example, the Imperial Order of the Daughters of the Empire was very organized and had a president and a secretary, but many of them just seem to be sort of ad hoc groups, and the host was the woman whose house they were meeting at that week, and then the next week it would change over and be another one. So there's quite a range, I believe, from what I've found so far, about some being very organized and some being less organized.
So how much longer do you think your research is going to take?
Oh, I'll probably be doing this till I die. It's the more that I research, the more I realize I don't know, and how much more could be out there that we can find out. So I think it's going to keep me busy for quite a while, but I hope that I'm going to be able to find enough information that I can either put it into a book or put it into an exhibit where I can at least tell as much of the story as I've been able to find out, and perhaps inspire some other people to pick up the research and carry it farther. There's so much out there, and there's so many missing pieces that I would just love to be able to put the story together in a more complete way. But I think I'm going to need some help to do that. And but I'd have to say I'm finding it encouraging. The women that I do get to share this information with are talking to their families, and they're finding out more about the history of their own families and their mothers or grandmothers and their aunts' contributions to the war. And just that is exciting to me. I feel it's important that we celebrate this work, and really the only reason I'm doing this is to bring it to light so that more people can get a sense of what the contributions of women were during the war and what their lives were like. What they went through, and to celebrate it. And maybe we'll learn something about how we respond to times like that as well, and how quilting can be part of that time, and how we deal with it, and how we come together as a community, and how we share. And that's gratifying to me if we can learn from the past.
So what advice do you have for guilds or ad hoc groups right now that are working on, Quilts for Survivors or some of the other initiatives that have been out there? I'm just thinking just recently in Canadian history, we made Quilts for Humboldt. We did, there was an initiative from Nova Scotia making quilts for the survivors of that issue out there. Quilts for the survivors of residential schools. What kind of record should we be making so that there's a more complete history?
That's a great question. I hadn't thought about that. I guess from my own research and my own frustration with my research, I would say that each guild or group just keep a record of how many quilts you made, take photographs of them. It'd be important to say where the fabrics came from, and what the construction methods were. Did you, are they being long armed, or are they being quilted by hand, or are they being tied? All of that information could give clues, but I think it would also be great if they wrote down some of their perspectives, some of what they thought, some of what they felt or are feeling that's inspiring them to respond this way, because we can guess some, we can surmise, and as women, we sort of know ourselves intuitively why we're doing this, but I think it's good to put into words as well what we're feeling, and to say this is why we're inspired to make these. This is where it's coming from for us. And it's sort of a silent thing. We gather and we make and we say yes, and we want to be part of it, but sometimes we actually need to articulate what's going on in our hearts that is causing us to respond in this way with our hands. And it might help us to actually articulate that to children or to a new generation, to help them understand the value of making with their hands and how it can be healing for them as well as to the recipients who get the quilts.
If somebody who's watching has a story that they'd like to share with you, or a quilt they'd like to show you, or just find out more information about the research that you're doing, how do they find you?
I have a website called Suture and Selvedge, and the suture is for the stitching and the salvage is for the thread. So sutureandselvedge.com. I'm also on Instagram, and I have a Facebook group page about these quilts as well. And I would love to hear from anyone who has a story about their mother or grandmother or aunt, someone, even themselves as children during the war. I'd love to collect those stories. Also to hear of any quilts that they might have. Or know where there are quilts in Canada that may be related to the war effort. Because I think there might be some more out there that I don't know about, and I'd love to have a complete inventory of what there is in Canada.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show today and sharing your story and your research. I'm so excited to hear anything that you've got, and I will continue to check in with your website.
Oh, I appreciate that very much. It's been great to be here. Thank you very much, Karen.
I hope you've enjoyed my interview with JOANNA DERMENJIAN. You can see just how important that label on the quilt can be. If you have a quilt story, or pictures that might be of interest to JOANNA and her research, I'll leave all her contact information in the notes below. Also, check out her website, Suture and Selvedge, for photos and stories of what she's discovered. Next up on Karen's Quilt Circle is Tula Pink, and we will be talking about the building of her brand. She makes it look effortless, but she's put a lot of effort and time into making it what it is today. You don't want to miss it, so be sure to subscribe. Next time you're in your sewing room, make sure Karen's Quilt Circle is playing in the background. I have interviewed so many interesting and amazing people on this series. Let one inspire you. And check out my last video, which is episode 1 of my Quilt Coat series. So take care, and I'll see you next time.